This lecture will survey the historical and aesthetic context of the Enlightenment in preparation for our discussion of Alexander Pope and Voltaire. The European Enlightenment is an intellectual and historical period that, for our class, we'll define as occurring between 1649 and 1793. We're picking these two dates to bookend our definition of the Enlightenment because they mark significant political events. In 1649, we have the English Revolution, which resulted in the beheading of Charles I, and in 1793, we have the French Revolution and beheading of Louis XVI. France and England were the crucibles in Europe for the Enlightenment, and besides these two being important historical dates, these events have particular significance for us because they represent the zeitgeist, or spirit, of the age. The Enlightenment was very much about questioning authority, be that religious, political, moral, or intellectual authority. And what these beheadings show is that from its beginning to its end, the people were beginning to challenge the royal houses in very real ways. Both of the royal houses, that is, the Stuart and Bourbon houses of Great Britain and France respectively, were overthrown shortly after these beheadings and turned from absolute to constitutional monarchies. Another distinguishing feature about these two events is the technology with which both monarchs were beheaded. While Charles I was decapitated with a sword, Louis XVI was decapitated by a guillotine, a machine that signals the massive advancements European society had made in technological innovation, as well as represents again the knowledge-seeking impulse of the Enlightenment age. Immediately before and during the Enlightenment, the individual was beginning to be empowered. We might think of history as being roughly divided into three stages in a very broad and general way. First, there is the pre-modern period, which indicates a time when people put authority in the church and God. This means that your sense of morality, as well as all other knowledge, for instance, what social systems were best for civilization, how the universe works, etc., comes from faith and authorized institutions. History at this time was also perceived as largely cyclical, recurring as we follow the same predetermined plans of God. The second period, modernity, indicates the centuries where scientific disciplines are beginning to take root and influence the shape of society. In the West, this period begins with the early modern period, or the Renaissance, but takes fuller shape during the Enlightenment. Authority is progressively weaned away from the church and religion and instead being put in the hands of the individual, who is beginning to be educated and can rely on his or her own reason, observations, and experience to come to conclusions about ethics, social ills, and the natural processes of the universe. Meanwhile, history at this point begins to be perceived as linear rather than cyclical, as people begin to believe in the prospect of progress. That is, the idea that with the empowered individual and with knowledge at our fingertips, we can break out of the cycles of past and move forward. This hope is also accompanied by the belief, supported by increasingly mechanical views of the cosmos, that mankind is perfectible rather than inherently limited as a finite creature of God's creation. In some ways, authority during modernity is still largely anchored in institutions such as the government, patriarchs, fathers, men, and science. But we are beginning to move towards a more empowered people. Note, too, that modernity as a historical period is not the same as modernism, the literary movement, which we will encounter later this semester around week 4. The third period, postmodernity, typically indicates the latter half of the 20th century or the decades that followed the world wars. It's not really necessary to talk about postmodernism yet, but we will get to it come around week 5. So for now, just know that there is a third historical period and we'll learn more about that later. What's important to focus on right now is the shift from pre-modernity to modernity. During the Renaissance, which took place around the 14th through 17th centuries, we begin shifting from pre-modern to modern conditions. Texts and artifacts from classical antiquity were beginning to be recovered, and this stimulated a return to studies of classical Greek and Roman arts and philosophy, as opposed to a reliance on church education and theology. During the Renaissance, we also have the invention of the famous Gutenberg movable type. This happened around the 1440s, and with the invention of printing presses and mass printing came a vernacular revolution. Literacy rose, enabling individuals to take charge of their own education. As printed materials became cheaper and more widely disseminated, they increasingly targeted the emerging middle class, and the use of and confidence in the vernacular languages increased. Vernacular languages are the languages of the common people, so for instance, English, German, French, Spanish, and so forth. And all of this was a drastic change from what came before. In pre-modernity, the illiterate public had to rely on the clergy to read and learn for them. All knowledge came from the church, and as a result was about the church. And this was in part due to the fact that most texts were written in Latin or Greek, so only the educated elite could have access to this knowledge. Once the printing press was invented, all this started to change. The vernacular revolution broke the monopoly the literate elite had on education and learning. With the Renaissance, education then began to take on its shape as we know it today, focusing on a study of the liberal arts, ranging from subjects in the humanities and sciences, and preparing individuals to be good citizens. That is, after all, what a liberal arts education does. It's education for the free or liberated citizen. And the Renaissance galvanized the idea that the individual, rather than the church, can have a hand in the production of knowledge and study of ethics. The Renaissance also overlaps with the Scientific Revolution, which ranges from about 1550 to 1700, and had an effect on modernity and the Enlightenment. The Scientific Revolution is typically said to have begun with Nicholas Copernicus's mid-16th century heliocentric or sun-centered theory of the solar system, which replaced the geocentric one before that. This Copernican revolution is credited with unsettling the way people looked at humankind, in particular challenging the perspective that humans are central to the universe. At the tail end of the scientific revolution is Sir Isaac Newton's mathematical principles. Newton is credited with synthesizing the views up to that point and successfully communicating the idea that the universe is indeed based on constant, predictable, and systematic laws, that the cosmos is mechanical rather than purely divine or divinely inspired. This too challenged previous conceptions of the cosmos as only comprehensible through faith, and altogether the scientific revolution introduced the importance of reason. So this brings us to the Enlightenment. We have an emerging literate class as well as growing emphasis on the authority of the individual and reason. With all this, we also have an Enlightenment impulse to gather and amass information. In fact, it was during the Enlightenment that we have our first encyclopedias. The first Encyclopedia Britannica was published in 1768, near the end of the Enlightenment. There were two basic ways an individual could contribute knowledge to the intellectual community. This is through empiricism and rationalism. Empiricists base their knowledge off of observations and experiences. Today, we usually associate empiricists with scientists, but really everyone in some way is an empiricist. For instance, we learn not to touch the stove when it's on because our experiences tell us that that hurts. Or we learn to distinguish between different kinds of plants based on observations of their different appearances. So not every empiricist is a scientist in the conventional sense that we normally think of scientists today. This is true for us, especially because we tend to normally associate scientists with objectivity as well, or knowledge that is based outside of the self, especially in objects like tools. Objective processes help to ensure that the biases of the self are not as involved in the production of knowledge, and there were certainly scientists and philosophers of the Renaissance and Enlightenment, like Francis Bacon, the philosopher known for establishing the scientific method, who supported objective empiricism. Bacon believed that we must eliminate the human factor and biases in productions of knowledge in order to discover the unchanging, timeless truths of the universe. In particular, this meant comparing experiments and observations in order to eliminate mistakes made from particular cases and biases. But it's important to know that there is also subjective empiricism, or knowledge based in just one's own personal observations and experiences. John Locke, a seminal Enlightenment thinker, is a subjective empiricist. He believed that humans are all born blank slates, or tabula rasa, and that all of our knowledge, even our imagination, comes from our sensory experiences. And this is why beauty is relative and religions have different interpretations of scripture. It's also why we develop seemingly irrational fears, like fear of the dark. Perhaps someone told us that we should be afraid of the dark, or we observed that bad things generally happen at night as opposed to during the day. Empiricists only make up one side of Enlightenment thinkers, though. There are also the rationalists. Rationalists believe that one only needs to use reason and logic in order to deduce or intuit the nature of the world. René Descartes, famous for his phrase, "I think, therefore I am," is a famous rationalist. Note how even his phrase, "I think, therefore I am," is based not really on observation or experimentation, but on a logical process. He identifies a premise, "I think," and then draws a logical conclusion on what that means, "therefore I am." Rationalists tend to believe that there are innate ideas, for instance, that we all have an innate sense of beauty and goodness, or at least that humans have an innate sense of what counts as rationality. For instance, we generally think that if we say something is not X, it cannot simultaneously be X, because that would be a contradiction. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz is another rationalist who is important to know for our readings of Pope and Voltaire. Leibniz promoted the philosophy of optimism, or the belief that this world that we live in is the best of all possible worlds. He supported this argument through a series of logical steps that, generally speaking, may be summarized as going back to assumptions that God cannot be evil or ignorant, and therefore this reality must be intentional and must be the best of all possible worlds. So, to reiterate, both empiricists and rationalists see the individual as the source of knowledge, not authorities or faith. As Europe modernized, there were disagreements about just how much one should rely on the individual, though. A debate arose known as the Quarrel of the Ancients and Moderns, or the Battle of the Books between the Book of God and the Book of Nature. The ancients are those who put authority in past institutions and traditions. These included authorities such as the church, as well as authorities such as the Romans and Greeks. The ancients would promote returning to classical texts and examining them anew to refresh our understanding of them. This is not the same thing as relying solely on the church, though, since an individual could now examine texts himself and draw conclusions without the church as an intermediary. On the other hand, moderns were those who were willing to challenge the past authorities of the church and the classics, for instance, through the study of the sciences. The ancients tended to be traditionalists then, while the moderns tended to be the progressives. However, the ancients also tended to see the moderns as vain, since they relied on themselves rather than past authorities for the production of knowledge. One last point to keep in mind as we move forward this semester is that ancients and moderns can both be rationalists, although empiricists tend to be moderns. Against all odds, Alexander Pope is considered one of the greatest poets of the early 18th century. He was the son of a linen draper and a Catholic in Britain, which in the early 18th century meant that he could not attend university, vote, or hold public office. He couldn't even own a home within 10 miles of London. When he was a child, he suffered an illness that stunted his growth, distorting his spine and resulting in him becoming a hunchbacked cripple. He lamented this disfigurement, famously calling it "this long disease my life," but he was incredibly sharp. He made up for his disadvantages by studying and reading a lot. If anyone made fun of his hunchback, he made use of his quick wit to lash back at them. He became a poet at age 15 and fashioned himself after classical artists such as Virgil and Horace. For instance, he believed in such principles as the Horatian dictum, which states that art must delight as well as instruct. And over the course of his life, he dedicated himself to the fight for this kind of humanistic learning, sound art, good taste, and public virtue. He is a classic example of an ancient. The Essay on Man is a work of theodicy, or work that answers the question or problem of evil. That is, one of the big questions of the Enlightenment was, why does evil exist? Or how can evil exist if God is good? This is the question that Leibniz mentioned earlier asked and answered with optimism, and Pope answered similarly. Others who were more pessimistic answered this problem of evil question by saying things like, God must not be powerful enough to bring about a better world, or God does not exist, or God is not good. But Pope, taking after Leibniz's philosophy, wrote the Essay on Man in order to vindicate or justify divine goodness despite the existence of evil. As Pope says in line 16, the purpose of this work is to, quote, vindicate the ways of God to man. The work became an intellectual landmark of the 18th century because it embodies the cosmological, theological, and ethical thought of its age.